I bought a janitor lunch, and my fiancée dumped me in front of 40 colleagues at our company cafeteria. For 6 years, I'd believed we were building a life together, but I'd forgotten the night I overheard her tell her sister that she was settling until someone better came along. Words I'd convinced myself I misheard, because admitting the truth would mean facing that I'd repeated my father's greatest mistake. My fiancé's last words to me were, "You're embarrassing," spoken with venom as I handed my lunch to a janitor who looked like he'd skipped meals to make rent, and I'd never seen that look of disgust in her eyes. But I'd seen that same look on my father's face the day he walked out on my mother and me, leaving us with nothing but an empty penthouse and a pile of legal documents I was too young to understand. I'd spent 28 years believing I was nobody, the abandoned son of a failed businessman raised by a single mother who scrubbed floors, always one paycheck from disaster. But there was a locked drawer in my mother's apartment filled with letters I wasn't allowed to read. Letters with law firm letterheads and phrases like beneficial heir and deferred distribution upon character verification. My father once told me, weeks before he vanished when I was 7, that the measure of a man isn't his portfolio but his principles. But all I remembered was watching my mother's tears and learning that principles don't pay rent, which made me measure worth in hard work, not bank accounts. That janitor's weathered hands trembled as he accepted the meal, and he looked at me with recognition I didn't understand, murmuring, "You have his heart, and your father would be proud," which made no sense because my father was a ghost, a name on documents I'd stopped trying to understand. But my fiancée was already texting someone, laughing about how I'd wasted money on trash while she waited for her new boyfriend to pick her up in his leased Mercedes, announcing she was leaving me for her boss, someone with real ambition and actual money. The janitor thanked me with a handshake that felt strangely firm, almost corporate, gripped my hand and whispered, "The test is complete," then walked away with a posture that suddenly seemed too straight, too confident, too purposeful for someone who cleaned toilets. But my fiancée was already gone, her engagement ring left on the table like trash. What I didn't know was that the janitor was Marcus Chen, the billionaire CEO of Chen Global Properties and the largest commercial real estate firm in the state, conducting undercover evaluations of character. My father's best friend, who'd been searching for me for 15 years, who'd promised my dying father he'd find me and verify I'd inherited integrity rather than entitlement. What neither of us knew was that my father hadn't abandoned us. He'd died, protecting a real estate empire from hostile takeover, and his will stipulated that only a son who proved worthy through character, not greed, could inherit the $2 billion trust that had been waiting in my name since childhood, and that those legal documents from my childhood weren't about my father abandoning me, but about an empire waiting for the right heir to claim it, and that every person I'd helped, every act of unnoticed kindness over the past decade, had been carefully documented. The question is, how did a single $12 act of compassion shatter my engagement, expose a 15-year mystery about my father's death, unlock a fortune I never knew existed, reveal my true identity, and force me to choose between the fortune everyone dreams of and the values that actually define a meaningful life? And how does losing the woman you loved and discovering you're the heir to a fortune you never wanted force you to confront who you really are versus who you've been pretending to be? This story exposes how people reveal their true nature when they think you have nothing, and how desperation for acceptance makes us ignore red flags that could save us years of pain. Reveals that true wealth isn't about what you display, but what you do when no one important is watching, and that inheritance isn't just about wealth, but about the values that make you worthy of it. Teaches that authentic character is tested in the smallest moments, and that real legacy is about character tests that happen when you think no one's watching. Demonstrates why the worst betrayals prepare you for the greatest transformations, and that real wealth is being tested and passing without knowing the stakes, and shows you how the relationships you think define you can blind you to your actual destiny, and how to distinguish between people who love your potential and people who love your person, and why the most life-changing opportunities often come disguised as ordinary moments, and why your darkest moments often happen right before your breakthrough, because sometimes losing everything you thought mattered is the only way to discover what you were always meant to become, because recognizing worth in others is the first step to recognizing your own, because the moment you stop performing for approval is the moment your real life begins, and because who you are when you think you have nothing is who you truly are when you have everything. The cafeteria was loud with the usual Tuesday lunch crowd, but the silence at my table felt deafening as I watched Jessica scroll through her phone with barely concealed irritation. She'd been distant for weeks, maybe months if I was honest with myself, but I'd been too afraid to acknowledge what that meant. I'd learned early that asking questions sometimes gave you answers you couldn't live with. Learned it the day I asked my mother why Dad left, and she just showed me his empty closet without a word. The chicken sandwich in front of me looked dry and uninspiring, but it was what I could afford on my nonprofit salary, the same salary Jessica had started calling temporary, and then disappointing and finally pathetic when she thought I was asleep. I noticed the elderly janitor 2 tables over, the one with kind eyes who always nodded at me in the mornings, sitting alone with just a cup of coffee while everyone else ate. His uniform was worn at the edges, the name tag reading Jim in faded letters, and something about the way his shoulders sagged reminded me of my mother after double shifts, that bone-deep exhaustion that comes from invisible work nobody thanks you for. I stood up with my tray, ignoring Jessica's sigh of exasperation, and walked over to his table. "Excuse me, sir," I said, and his eyes met mine with a sharpness that seemed odd for someone who looked so tired. "I noticed you didn't get lunch. Would you like this? I haven't touched it." His face transformed, with something between surprise and emotion I couldn't name. But before he could respond, Jessica's voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a knife. "Are you serious right now, David?" She was standing, her chair scraping back dramatically, her voice loud enough that conversations around us stopped. "You're giving away your lunch to him?" The way she said him made my stomach turn, made me think of all the times she'd steered me away from my mother's neighborhood, all the comments about better circles and networking up. The janitor reached for the tray with trembling hands, but his grip when he touched my arm was surprisingly strong, almost purposeful. "Thank you, son," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that didn't match the uniform, something refined and measured. "Your father would be very proud of the man you've become." I froze. "My father? Did you know?" But Jessica was already at my side, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my elbow as she yanked me away. "We're done," she hissed, her face twisted with contempt I'd never seen before, or maybe I'd just been too desperate to notice it. "I can't do this anymore, David. You're never going to be anything. You choose nonprofits over real careers. You give away money we don't have. You're exactly like your pathetic father who died broke and forgotten." She pulled off her engagement ring, the modest one I'd saved 8 months to buy, and dropped it on the table with a clatter that echoed in the sudden silence. "Richard offered me a position at his firm, senior partner. He has ambition, he has money, he has everything you'll never have." Richard, her boss, the man she'd been taking late meetings with, the one who sent her flowers she claimed were from clients. The pieces clicked together like a puzzle I'd been refusing to see, like the puzzle of my father's departure that I'd never had the courage to solve. "How long?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. She laughed, cold and bright. "Does it matter?" "Long enough to know I made a mistake 6 years ago. You're a project manager at a homeless shelter, David. You'll never amount to anything." She grabbed her purse and walked away, her heels clicking against the linoleum, and I watched her go with the strangest sense of relief, mixed with devastation, like watching a house collapse that you'd been too afraid to admit was already crumbling. The cafeteria slowly returned to its normal noise level, but I felt 40 pairs of eyes still on me, witnessing my humiliation, my failure, my proof that I was exactly what Jessica said I was. I turned back to the janitor, expecting pity, but his eyes held something else entirely. Approval, assessment, satisfaction. He was eating the sandwich with precise movements that seemed too refined, too deliberate, and when he stood, his posture straightened in a way that transformed him from elderly janitor to something else entirely, something commanding. "Walk with me, David," he said, and it wasn't a request. I followed him out of the cafeteria, through hallways I'd walked 1,000 times, but which suddenly felt unfamiliar, until we reached the executive elevator I'd never been authorized to use. He pulled out a key card from inside his janitor's uniform, and the elevator opened immediately. Inside, he pressed the button for the penthouse level, the floor I didn't even know existed in this building. "My name isn't Jim," he said as the elevator climbed. "It's Marcus Chen. I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Chen Global Properties. This building and 47 others in this city belong to me. So does the nonprofit where you work, and the homeless shelter you manage, and the 3 community centers you helped fund with grants you wrote on your own time." My mind reeled, trying to connect the janitor's uniform to the name Marcus Chen, a name I'd seen on buildings across the skyline, on charitable foundations, in business journals my mother used to bring home from the offices she cleaned. "I don't understand," I managed. "Why were you—" "Your father was my best friend," Marcus said, and the elevator seemed to slow, or maybe time did. "Thomas Wright. We built Chen Global together, but when hostile investors tried to take over 15 years ago, someone had to disappear to protect the assets, to make them think the company was vulnerable. Thomas took that role. He staged his death in a car accident, went into hiding, and trusted me to find his son when the time was right." The elevator doors opened to a marble lobby that looked like it cost more than every apartment I'd ever lived in combined. "But he didn't just leave you money, David. He left you a test. He made me promise that his heir would only inherit if they proved worthy, not through business savvy or ambition, but through character, through the kind of person they were when no one important was watching." We walked through glass doors into an office that overlooked the entire city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view that took my breath away. But Marcus kept talking. "For 10 years, I've watched you. The homeless man you bought coffee for every morning. He works for me, reporting acts of kindness. The elderly woman whose groceries you carried, my assistant. The teenager whose college application you helped edit at the library, my nephew. Every single person you helped without expecting anything in return. Every moment you chose compassion over convenience. Every time you gave when you had nothing to give. I documented it all." He opened a drawer in the massive desk and pulled out a file thick with papers, photographs, reports. "Your father died 3 months ago, David. Really died this time, of cancer, in a hospital room where he made me promise one last time, to find you, to test you, to make sure his son hadn't been corrupted by the poverty you endured or the bitterness you had every right to feel." I couldn't process his words, couldn't reconcile the janitor with the CEO, couldn't understand how my father could be both dead and alive and dead again, couldn't grasp that my entire life had been a test I didn't know I was taking. "Today was the final evaluation," Marcus continued. "I needed to see what you'd do when you had almost nothing, when your relationship was clearly failing, when helping someone else meant sacrificing your own comfort. You passed, David. You passed every single test your father designed." He pulled out another document, this one with legal seals and signatures, and slid it across the desk. Thomas Wright wasn't broke when he died. He was worth $2.4 billion held in trust, waiting for his son, waiting for you. This company, these properties, this empire, it's yours. It's been yours since you were 7 years old. We were just waiting for you to prove you deserved it. The skyline blurred through sudden tears. I didn't remember starting to cry, and I thought about my mother scrubbing floors while billions sat in a bank account we couldn't touch. Thought about Jessica leaving me for being poor when I was secretly rich. Thought about every night I'd gone to bed angry at a father who hadn't abandoned me, but had sacrificed everything to protect me. "My mother," I whispered. "Does she know?" Marcus's face softened. "She's known everything. Thomas made her promise to raise you without the money, to let you learn the value of work and compassion and integrity. It destroyed her to watch you struggle. But she trusted your father's vision. She's downstairs, David. She's been waiting 21 years to tell you the truth." The office door opened, and my mother walked in, not in her cleaning uniform, but in an elegant suit I'd never seen, her hair styled professionally, looking like someone who belonged in a place like this, and I realized with stunning clarity that she'd been pretending too, playing a role, protecting me from a truth I wasn't ready to handle. "Your father loved you more than you'll ever know," she said, her voice breaking. "He gave up everything, his identity, his relationship with you, years of his life, to make sure you inherited not just his fortune, but his character. He wanted you to know what it meant to struggle, to choose kindness when it cost you something, to be good when being good had no reward." I looked at the legal documents, at my name printed next to numbers that didn't seem real, at the city spread below me like a kingdom I'd never asked for, and thought about Jessica's parting words, about how I'd never amount to anything, about how she'd chosen Richard's money over whatever I was. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. I'd lost someone who loved me for what she thought I could give her, and gained everything I'd never known I had. But the person I was hadn't changed at all. I was still the guy who bought lunch for janitors, still the project manager at a homeless shelter, still my father's son in the ways that actually mattered. "What happens now?" I asked, and Marcus smiled. "Now you decide what kind of heir you want to be. You can take the money and walk away from the work you do, or you can use $2 billion to expand every program you've ever dreamed of, to hire staff for every shelter that needs them, to fund every nonprofit that's barely surviving. Your father built this fortune, but he always said real wealth was measured in lives changed, not accounts balanced. The choice is yours." Through the window, I could see the street where I'd walked that morning, see the nonprofit building where I'd spent 5 years trying to make a difference with nothing but determination, and donated supplies. See the city that had watched me struggle and fail and persist without knowing I was being tested every single day. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Hope you enjoy your pathetic life. Richard and I are celebrating at Nobu tonight. Try not to think about what you lost." I looked at the message, at the woman who'd measured my worth in salary and status, who'd left me at my lowest moment for someone with a better portfolio, and I felt nothing but pity for everything she'd never understand. I deleted the text without responding and turned to Marcus and my mother, to the truth that had been waiting in locked drawers and sealed documents and a father's dying wish. "I want to expand the shelter," I said. "I want to fund every program we've ever had to turn down, hire every counselor we've needed, open 10 more locations. I want to take this fortune my father protected and turn it into exactly what he hoped it would be, not a monument to wealth, but a tool for change." Marcus extended his hand, and this time, when I shook it, I understood the firmness, the purpose, the weight of everything that handshake represented. "Welcome home, Mr. Wright," he said. "Let's change the world." 6 months later, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Chen Global Properties headquarters, surrounded by 200 people whose lives had intersected with mine, in ways I was only beginning to understand. The annual charitable gala had been my father's tradition, Marcus told me, a night where he'd celebrated not profits but impact, not shareholders but the community he'd sworn to serve. Now it was my tradition to continue, my first public appearance as the CEO of Right Chen Foundation, the entity we'd created to manage the fortune I'd inherited and transform it into something my father would recognize as worthy of his sacrifice. My mother stood beside me in a midnight blue gown, no longer pretending to be anyone other than who she'd always been, a woman who'd loved her husband enough to honor his impossible request, who'd scrubbed floors she could have owned to teach her son the lessons that money couldn't buy. She squeezed my hand as I approached the podium, and I saw tears in her eyes that were equal parts grief and pride, mourning the man who'd made this moment possible, but would never see it. I'd visited my father's grave 3 times since learning the truth, each time trying to reconcile the man who'd walked away with the man who'd orchestrated everything from the shadows, and each time I'd left with more questions than answers, but also with a growing understanding that love sometimes looked like absence, that protection sometimes required distance, that the greatest gifts were often wrapped in the hardest sacrifices. The room quieted as I began to speak, my voice steadier than I'd expected. 6 months ago, I thought I knew who I was. I was David Wright, project manager at a homeless shelter, engaged to a woman who I believed loved me, convinced that my father had abandoned my mother and me because we weren't worth staying for. I was wrong about almost everything. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd, but I saw deeper understanding in some faces. The formerly homeless man who now worked as our intake coordinator, the single mother whose rent we'd covered who was now finishing her nursing degree, the teenager I'd helped with college applications who was home from Stanford for the summer. My father didn't abandon me. He gave me the greatest gift any parent can give their child. He taught me who I was when I had nothing, so I'd know who to be when I had everything. I glanced at the back of the room where Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his presence steady, the man who'd honored a promise for 15 years and tested me without mercy because the stakes were too high for anything less. Someone very wise once told me that real wealth is measured in lives changed, not accounts balanced. In the past 6 months, we've opened 12 new shelter locations across 3 cities. We've hired 83 full-time counselors, social workers, and case managers. We've funded 17 nonprofits that were on the verge of closing. We've provided housing for 214 families who were living in their cars. We've covered medical bills for 67 people who couldn't afford treatment. We've paid for 42 college educations for students who'd given up hope of affording school. The numbers felt both enormous and insufficient, proof of what money could do, but also proof of how much remained undone, how many people still needed help, how the work would never truly be finished. But the most important thing we've done, I continued, is remember that every number is a person, every statistic is a story, every line item in our budget represents a human being who deserves dignity and compassion and a chance to rebuild their lives. My father understood that. He built a fortune, yes, but he built it on the principle that success without service is just accumulation, that wealth without purpose is just numbers on a page. I pulled out a worn photograph from my pocket, one I'd found in the locked drawer in my mother's apartment, a picture of my father at 7 years old standing outside a homeless shelter with a sign that read, "Nobody should be invisible." Marcus had told me the story. My father had grown up in poverty, had been homeless twice as a child, had built his empire specifically so he could dismantle the systems that had failed him. He hadn't just wanted an heir who was kind. He'd wanted an heir who understood what it meant to be unseen, to be dismissed, to be measured by circumstances rather than character. I bought a janitor lunch 6 months ago, I said, and I heard the shuffle of recognition from people who knew the story, who'd heard the rumors, who'd witnessed my very public humiliation in that cafeteria. It cost me $12 and my engagement, but it gave me back my father's legacy and my own sense of purpose. The woman who left me that day told me I'd never amount to anything, that I was wasting my potential on people who didn't matter, that I should aspire to be someone important. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. She was working here tonight, actually, as a guest of Richard Morrison, senior partner at Morrison & Associates, the firm that handles our legal work. I saw her in the lobby an hour ago, saw the recognition in her eyes when she realized who I was, saw the calculation replace the shock as she understood what she'd walked away from. The room was completely silent now, everyone leaning forward slightly, invested in a story that had become legend in business circles. The heir who didn't know he was an heir, the CEO disguised as a janitor, the engagement that ended at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps exactly the right one. She asked if we could talk, asked if I remembered what we had together, suggested that maybe we'd both made mistakes we could correct. And I told her the truth, that she hadn't made a mistake at all. She'd shown me exactly who she was, had given me the gift of clarity when I'd been too afraid to see it myself, had left me at precisely the moment I needed to understand the difference between people who love what you have and people who love who you are. I saw my mother nod slightly, remembering perhaps her own moment of clarity when my father had asked her to raise their son in poverty, while billions sat in a trust, remembering the choice she'd made to honor love over comfort, purpose over ease. Richard Morrison is here tonight too, I continued, and I'm grateful for his firm's excellent work on our foundation's legal structure. I'm also grateful that he and Jessica found each other, that they're building a life based on the values they share, values that simply aren't mine and never were. There's no villain in this story, just people who want different things, who measure success in different ways, who couldn't see each other clearly because they were too busy performing for an audience that didn't actually matter. I'd seen them earlier, Richard with his arm around Jessica's waist, both of them wearing designer clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month, both of them looking successful and polished, and exactly like people who belonged at a charity gala because it was good for their image rather than because they cared about the cause. They weren't bad people. They just weren't my people, and the fortune I'd inherited had made that distinction impossible to ignore. My father spent 15 years dead so that I could spend 28 years becoming someone worthy of his life's work, I said, my voice catching slightly on the magnitude of that sacrifice. He gave up his name, his relationship with me, his chance to watch me grow up, because he believed that character couldn't be taught in privilege, that integrity couldn't be inherited along with money, that the only way to ensure his fortune served its purpose was to ensure his son understood what it meant to have nothing. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering why my father had left, all the anger I'd directed at a man who'd actually loved me more than I could comprehend, all the years I'd measured my worth against his abandonment, when I should have been measuring it against the values he'd died trying to instill in me. He was right. If I'd grown up knowing about this money, I'd have become someone else entirely, someone softer, someone more entitled, someone who gave away $12 lunches because it made me feel good about myself rather than because someone needed it more than I did. The applause started slowly and then built, people rising to their feet, and I saw tears on faces throughout the room, people who understood that this wasn't just about money or inheritance or business success, but about what we choose to value when we have the freedom to choose anything at all. Marcus was clapping too, his expression finally showing the emotion he'd kept hidden for 6 months, the weight of a promise fulfilled, a trust honored, a friend's dying wish brought to completion. I'd asked him once if he'd ever doubted whether I'd passed the tests, and he'd admitted that there were moments. Times when I'd been cruel in my frustration, times when I'd been selfish in my exhaustion, times when the grinding poverty had seemed like it might break something essential in my character. But then I'd always done something that reminded him why my father had believed in this plan, some small kindness that cost me something, some choice to help rather than hoard, some moment that proved the man I was becoming was worth the sacrifice my father had made. "So here's what I've learned," I said as the applause faded and people settled back into their seats. "Wealth isn't what you have, it's what you do with what you have. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you become in the process of building something worth leaving. Love isn't about finding someone who wants the same things you want, it's about becoming someone worthy of the love you hope to receive. And family isn't just biology or last names or shared history. It's every person who helps you become the best version of yourself, even when that help looks like absence, even when that help requires sacrifice you'll never fully understand, even when that help comes from a stranger in a janitor's uniform who sees something in you that you can't see in yourself." I looked directly at Marcus and he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and completion, and I knew that my father had chosen his best friend wisely, had trusted the right person with the most important test either of them would ever design. The Right Chen Foundation exists because my father believed that everyone deserves to be seen, that everyone deserves a chance, that everyone deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances, I concluded. Every person we help, every life we change, every family we support, that's his legacy continuing. That's his sacrifice meaning something. That's his love for a son he barely knew, transforming into love for a community that needs it desperately. I can't bring him back. I can't recover the years we lost, but I can honor what he gave up by becoming the man he hoped I'd be, by using this fortune the way he always intended, by remembering that the measure of my life isn't my portfolio but my principles. The ballroom erupted again, and this time I let myself feel the full weight of the moment. The grief for a father I'd never really known, the gratitude for a mother who'd sacrificed everything to honor his wishes, the respect for a man who'd tested me without mercy because the stakes were too high for kindness, the relief that I'd passed tests I hadn't known I was taking, the profound understanding that losing Jessica had been the beginning of finding myself. As people began to mingle and the orchestra started playing, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find Marcus with an envelope in his hand. "Your father wrote this the day before he died," he said quietly. "He made me promise to give it to you only after you'd proven yourself, only after you understood what he'd done and why. I think tonight is the right time." I took the envelope with shaking hands, my name written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew was my father's, and I excused myself to the balcony where the city lights spread below, like a constellation of possibilities. I opened it carefully, almost reverently, and began to read. "David, if you're reading this, then you passed. You became the man I hoped you would be. The man I saw glimpses of when you were 7 years old and cried because a classmate didn't have lunch money. The man I prayed you'd remain, even when poverty and hardship tried to make you bitter or cruel or selfish. I know you're angry at me. I know you've spent years wondering why I left, why I didn't fight to stay, why I chose whatever I chose over you and your mother. The truth is, I chose you. I chose the man you could become over the boy you were. I chose your future over my present. I chose to ensure my fortune served its purpose rather than corrupted the son I loved more than my own life. You'll understand this better if you ever have children of your own. This terrible knowledge that sometimes love means absence, that sometimes protection requires distance, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to become strong without you. I had to stop reading for a moment, had to breathe through the tears that blurred my vision, had to reconcile this father with the one I'd hated for so long. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known, the letter continued. She agreed to raise you in poverty while billions sat untouchable because she trusted my vision, because she believed that character mattered more than comfort, because she loved you enough to let you struggle. Honor her, David. Every sacrifice you made, she made twice over. Every night you went to bed hungry for anything, food, security, a father's presence. She went to bed knowing she could end your suffering with a single phone call, but chose not to because we'd made a promise to each other and to you. If you become half the person she is, my fortune will be in excellent hands. I thought about my mother inside, about the years she'd spent cleaning buildings she could have bought, about the lie she'd lived to protect a truth I wasn't ready for, and I understood that heroism sometimes looked like ordinary life lived with extraordinary purpose. The money doesn't matter, son, my father's letter concluded. It never did. What matters is that you know your worth isn't determined by what you have, but by what you do with what you have. That you understand success without service is just selfishness with better press. That you remember every person deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances or their usefulness to you. If you passed Marcus's tests, then you already know these things. You've already lived these principles. You've already become the heir I hoped for. Not an heir to my fortune, but an heir to my values, my purpose, my understanding that we're only wealthy when we use our wealth to lift others. I'm proud of you, David. I was proud of you at 7, and I'm proud of you now, wherever now is when you read this. Build something beautiful with what I've left you. Love someone worthy of your character. Live a life that proves my sacrifice wasn't wasted. And know that every single day I was away from you, I was thinking of you, hoping for you, believing in the man you'd become. You are my greatest accomplishment, not my fortune. Never forget that. Love always, Dad. I folded the letter carefully and looked out at the city, at the buildings my father had built, and the communities he'd served, and the legacy he'd entrusted to a son he'd barely known, but had somehow understood perfectly. Jessica was somewhere in the ballroom below, probably networking with Richard, probably relieved she'd dodged the bullet of a life with someone who gave away lunches instead of accumulating power. She'd never understand that she hadn't dodged anything. She'd simply revealed herself at the exact right moment, had shown me what my father had already known, that the wrong people leave at the perfect time to make room for the right purpose. I wasn't angry at her anymore. I was grateful. She'd freed me to become exactly who I was meant to be, had walked away from a man she couldn't value so he could finally value himself. I pulled out my phone and texted Marcus, "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for testing me. Thank you for honoring my father's wishes, even when it meant watching me struggle. I understand now." His response came immediately. "Your father knew what he was doing. You were always going to pass, David. We just needed you to see it for yourself." I smiled and put the phone away, my father's letter pressed against my chest, and I understood that this was what inheritance really meant. Not money or property or corporate holdings, but the understanding that we're all connected to people who came before us, people who sacrificed in ways we'll never fully comprehend, people who believed in futures they'd never see and invested in characters they'd never witness fully formed. My father had died twice so I could live once as the man he'd always hoped I'd be. And standing there on that balcony with the city spread below me like a promise waiting to be kept, I finally understood that the greatest fortune I'd inherited wasn't the billions in the bank. It was the knowledge of who I was when I had nothing, which meant I'd always know who to be when I had everything.